The potential for the upside here is amazing. We haven't seen this sort of era in Polish history in 600 years. This is kind of cool. The United States is going through a nativist period. This happens to us every generation or two. And whenever we do, we tend to turn our back onto the world. In, for example, immigration and China. Here are two issues that obviously reshape the economic and political landscape. But whether people are on the left or the right or in the center, right now they want the border closed and they want China destroyed. And the only variation is who is going to be more draconian on those topics. We will get through this. This is the 5th or 6th time we've done this as a country, but we're not going to figure it out in the next 2 or 3 years. This is something for next decade, most likely.
America is so, let's say, dependent on global chains that...
But it's not. Really? I mean, that's the big secret. When the United States created the globalized world, we did it in order to induce other countries to be on our side. Basically, we will patrol the global oceans for you if in exchange you join us in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. If we had invested our economy into the global commons as part of that deal, we would have just been a new British Empire, and no one liked them. So we didn't. So we subsidized indirectly the entire system, but we didn't join it. So now that we're in a situation where we're backing away, we're one of the very few countries that won't suffer from its fall. If you think of the United States not as a single country, but as part of the North American network with Canada and Mexico, that system only interacts with the rest of the world for about 4% of GDP.
But it's not only the GDP, but also the quality, let's say, of the exports and imports. I would like to ask you how the semiconductor global chain changed the equation. Because we have the Dutch, right? We have the Japanese that produce chemicals. We have Taiwan and foundries. And we have Americans that like their iPhones and other basic stuff.
Well, let me underline. Low exposure doesn't mean no exposure. And getting from here to there with the American reindustrialization that's underway right now, it's not cheap. It's not going to be quick. It is going to happen. The United States' role in the international system economically kind of falls into two general buckets. The first are the primary commodities that you're discussing, oil and food, and then adding value to them, so fuels and processed foods. Very, very important. The second bucket is because the United States really doesn't have to worry about national defense of the homeland, we've been able to specialize on really, really high value-added products. So for example, in your semiconductor example, we're on the high end and the low end. On the high end, almost all of the design for any chip that is better than 20 nanometers, which includes, among other things, this, comes from the United States. And I think every design that's better than 5 nanometers, which includes all artificial intelligence, comes from the United States. And on the low end, all the silicon in all chips comes from North freaking Carolina. If globalization were to shatter today, would we have chips in the volume we need? No, but nobody would.
How about labor? Do you think this is also maybe a reason to maintain the system? Because otherwise you will have to pay a lot to your workers to do the job, like, for example, you do in Taiwan or in China.
Let me give you an example. Going back to the 1980s, before the United States had the free trade agreement with Mexico, all of our clothes were made by women who lived in mountain states, the poorer mountain states, with sewing machines. And then NAFTA happened and those jobs picked up and moved over to Mexico, but the model was the same. And then the World Trade Organization happened and those jobs picked up and moved over to India, China, and Bangladesh, but the model was the same. And then COVID happened and everyone shut down at the same time. And, you know, Americans are many things, but we do not look like the Swedes, and going naked was never an option. And what we discovered was some entrepreneurial folks in the textile industry started setting up new facilities in the United States where you would have a hectare facility that could bring in raw cotton, turn it into thread, turn it into yarn, turn it into cloth, and cut it. And the end product per square meter that came out was cheaper than what came out of Bangladesh. These facilities had a staff of 2. The United States has been moving manufacturing abroad for so long that the technology has had a chance to evolve. And it's not until we have that Swedish moment that we're going to think to look to see what we can do. Will it work with everything? Of course not. But we never would have dreamed that the United States would be the lowest cost, highest volume producer of textiles today. I mean, and for every industry where that is true, there's probably an industry where it's not true. And this is going to be awkward.
You write about hoard lands. It's mostly the
fun topic. Okay.
Yeah. Russia possesses, right?
Yep.
But Halford, John McIntyre, obviously know him. He called it the heartland, which is very known expression. So he was afraid, and many other Western analysts and experts, that the power that holds heartland somehow unite with the power of which is surrounding heartland. One of the powers, for example, Germany or China, which is more fertile, has more production, which is more, let's say, technologically advanced. And this is going to serious threat to the US because they together will have more resources than any of the other islands that the world has.
Let's take a quick walk through history. The idea of the heartlands, the hoardlands, the midland, whatever you want to call it, everyone has their own term looking at it from a slightly different point of view. I focus more on the economics of how you manage it. McNamara, of course, focuses more on the access points. They're all legitimate ways to view the issue. But the bottom line is that the government that's in the core of Eurasia, there are multiple access points to both East Asia and Europe, and then also moving south into Southern Asia and especially the Middle East. And it's very, very difficult for whoever controls Greater Moscow, if you want to call it that, Russia, if you want to call it that, to prevent all of these areas from penetrating in. And so the most successful that it's ever been was under Stalin, when all of those access points were controlled by the Soviet Union. It never lasts. And even if you can get half of them, then the other half are open. So Russia is the most invaded country in human history to still exist today because of this vulnerability of access. If you get a partnership between the country of the core and anyone on the periphery, it will always be temporary because everyone on the periphery sees the hoardlands as a threat, as something that's dominated by low tech, low investment, low productivity, but lots and lots and lots of people. And so there may be an alliance of convenience. The Nazis did that. The Chinese are doing that today. But it never lasts because what the core territories need is not what the outside powers can offer and vice versa. It can be an alliance of convenience, and that can matter, but it's never permanent.
And not to mention that you also believe that China is going to fall as a country.
Yeah, there's that too. Yeah.
Why is it so?
Let me give you two big reasons. Number one is globalization. Even if the United States wanted to maintain the system, and I would argue that politically we really do not, economically we really do not, and militarily I would argue we couldn't anymore even if we wanted to. Without globalization, the Chinese lose access to 80% of their energy and 80% of the components they use to grow their own food and 80% of their product exports. So when you want to talk about downsizing a country, when Europe has a recession and you knock 5 or 10% off of GDP, it hurts. Can you imagine having a famine on top of that and losing your entire export market? It's like just today, the 14th of May, the Biden administration slapped a 100% tax on electric vehicles and a 50% tax on solar cells and semiconductors. This is just the start. There's a contest going on in the United States right now between the Republicans and the Democrats who can be harsher on China. And so I would be very surprised if we don't have a broad-scale Trump-style tariff on everything out of China that's not more than 50% within 3 or 4 years, regardless of who wins the presidential election. So from a market point of view, China has no future. Far more importantly, far more deadly, 60, 50 years ago, the Chinese just stopped having kids. And we're now in a situation where there are twice as many Chinese in their 60s as there are 20-year-olds, and there's twice as many 20-year-olds as 10-year-olds, and there's twice as many 10-year-olds as 5-year-olds. This is a country that has no future. It's just a question of how it dies.
Is it just China? Because you mentioned demography a lot in your books, and I think you underline, stress very, very much this factor in the future of the world in your predictions. How the global demography will shape the future of our Earth.
When you industrialize and when you urbanize, and usually those two things go hand in hand, your birth rate steadily drops. With China, we've got two other factors in play. You've got the one-child policy, which was a deliberate suppression of the birth rate. And then number two, you've got almost a Russian-style corruption culture around the bureaucracy, which, as we're learning in the Ukraine war, might actually be worse than the Russians. And so you had basically local officials fabricating data to get better kickbacks. And every day it's changing the data, but it now looks like the birth rate in China in the last 6 years has dropped by more than what happened to the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust. And the kind of middle ground estimate now is that they've overcounted their population under 40 by over 100 million people. And it's probably worse than that too. So you compare it to the rest of the world, and China has gone from this middle-of-the-road developing country with a negative demographic picture to something that, by the middle ground of Chinese statisticians, is now the worst demographic picture of any country in any era ever.
How are the Europeans doing, for example? Or
not great. Not great.
Are they any better than China?
Europe didn't really get serious about industrializing in most places until between 1920 and 1950. And when you industrialize later, it's easier from a technological point of view and a capital point of view, but people move from the farm to the city a lot faster. So you get a faster decline. In the case of the United Kingdom and the United States, which were kind of sort of the first two countries to industrialize, it's been a fairly slow degradation. So for example, where the United States is demographically today in terms of birth rates, the Germans hit that in 1975. And so if we keep aging at our current rate, we're not going to be facing a German-style demographic collapse until 2070. That's a lot of time to hopefully learn a few things and figure out another path. In the case of Poland, you're in between because your industrialization process didn't really get going until the 90s. So you have a very similar demographic structure to the Germans, where they basically it comes out to people who are in the mid 60s and then just collapses in. You've got that same shape, but your bulge is in the early 40s. So if you do nothing else different, you have another 25 years before you're facing the German-style problem.
And we have migration from Ukraine, which is also supporting our population.
That helps a great deal. It's really hard to get a grip on that in terms of data, though. It appears that you've absorbed probably permanently 1 million to 1.5 million Ukrainians that are under age 40. That's probably really good. But when people are displaced, you never know where they're going to land, and it all depends on a lot of factors.
What's the future in Poland in the upcoming decades, let's say, because you believe that Germany is going to be deprived of basic resources because of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, and you also believe that Russia is going to fall as a state, will be squeezed between those, let's say, revolutionary powers. There will be no freedom of navigation, or there will be freedom, but we won't have our navy to protect our deliveries. In terms of energy and economy and security, was the future of Poland?
Well, let me give you the bad scenario and the good scenario. It really matters how Russia dies. If they lose in Ukraine, we are looking at a disassociation of the Russian state within 20 years. That's obviously one scenario. If they win in Ukraine, they are absolutely coming for Warsaw. That takes us in a different direction. Let's assume for the moment that you get to keep Warsaw, because that scenario can go any number of directions. So we're talking about demographic dissolution on both sides of you, economic dissolution on both sides of you, military dysfunction on both sides of you. We've seen this movie before. As long as the North Sea is in play, as long as the Scandinavians are around, I don't think you're going to have an energy crisis. Worst case scenario, you've got lots of coal. As the Chinese system goes away, a lot of that mid-tier manufacturing that the Chinese have dominated, you're going to have to do the same thing we are. If you still want stuff, you're going to have to build it yourselves. That's an industrial renaissance. And of course, you've got the best farmland on this continent. And your input streams to make that farmland bloom isn't nearly as complicated as it is in, say, a place like Brazil or China. Your bones are good, your growth path is good, your demographics are nearly superior to everyone else on the continent except for, say, France and Sweden. The last time we had this sort of disconnect, with Poland looking stable to positive and the Germans and the Russians failing, you conquered Moscow. Now, I'm not saying like get out the pitchforks and get ready to march, but there's a 25-year window here where Polish power is very clearly rising and all your competitors are very clearly falling. The question is, what do you want to do with that? And can you get your birth rate up high enough so that this is more than just a window, that this is your new norm? But the potential for the upside here is amazing. We haven't seen this sort of era in Polish history in 600 years. This is kind of cool.
You write in your book that you think that the United States are going to have several partners in the world, the new world after the collapse, the full collapse of the Bretton Woods system. Poland is not one of them. The Netherlands in Europe, the UK obviously, and Denmark. Do you think that this is going to decrease our level of security that we have right now in Poland?
You'll have to do more things yourselves. What the United States is looking for are security for economics trades where what is on offer is more than what we would have to pay out. So during the Cold War, we did all the heavy lifting. And we were willing to subsidize directly or indirectly any number of countries in order to get that broad spectrum alliance versus the Soviet Union. That's not the environment we're in anymore. And so if you want a broad spectrum alliance with the United States, you have to bring something to the negotiating table. The only country to this point that has figured that out is Japan. They have entered into a trade deal with the United States that is humiliating. And they have built a couple of light carriers that now run exclusively American fighter jets. And to be perfectly blunt, they're under American strategic command. That was their price for buying their way into the inner circle. I don't know if as a land power between Germany or Russia, the Poles can offer something that is sufficiently robust for us to want to remain involved in the long term. But Sweden's less of a carry for us. Denmark's less of a carry. Britain is less of a carry. So there are a number of countries with excellent relations with Poland that have excellent relations with the United States. So think of Poland not as someone who gets left. Think of Poland as the outer circle. All you have to do is survive. You have a vested interest in doing that anyway.
We also need to think strategically ahead, like 30 years ahead, not only in the current politics, but this is our interest.
Well, and this is wild because when people think of law and justice in the United States, thinking ahead was not something that they were often accused of. But I gotta say, the weapons orders that they made from the South Koreans, they may have done it for the wrong reasons, in the wrong way, but if you take all that equipment, you learn to operate it yourselves, you will have a ground force that is more powerful than Germany and France and Spain and Italy combined. At the same time, your agricultural system is fine. At the same time, your energy system looks okay. At the same time, you're seeing an expansion of your industrial base. I'm telling you, the stars are telling me that this is the best it's been in 600 years.